It's November 7th, 1995, in Lake Asbury, a quiet waterfront community in northern Florida, just south of Jacksonville. At 8:31 p.m., a 911 operator gets a call from a distressed woman named Linda Jones. She says she is covered in blood, bound with duct tape that she can't get off, and her husband is dead. Linda and her husband, Jack Jones, were sitting in their living room watching TV when their doorbell rang. When Jack answered the door, Linda says that 3 men in ski masks overpowered him and forced their way in. Jack tried to defend himself and his wife, but he was outnumbered. Linda says that the men bound the couple with duct tape, robbed them, and then beat her husband to death. 8 minutes after the call, an officer arrives to find a seemingly unharmed but distressed 48-year-old Linda Jones on the front porch of her waterfront home. As the officer enters the house, he is immediately confronted with a brutal scene. Blood covered the walls and the floor of the foyer, and there, on the living room floor, lay Linda's husband, 48-year-old Jack Jones. His hands were duct taped above his head, and his feet were bound by tape as well. The officer turns back to Linda and then notices something odd. Amongst the gore of this scene, Linda has not a speck of blood on her. When police were dispatched, they were told that Linda had witnessed the murder and was bound with tape, just like her husband. But looking at her wrists and ankles now, there was nothing. So how did she get free? And why did this robbery gone wrong end in 1 death and not 2? This is the murder of Jack Jones. Hi strangers, this is your host Alexa Morrissey, and today we have a story of a suspicious home invasion that leads police into a twisted tale of betrayal and jealousy that ended in murder. Lock your doors and listen closely. This is Stranger in the House. Jack and Linda Jones had been married for 30 years before the break-in. Their friends described them as a perfect match. They both grew up in Jacksonville, Florida, and they seemed to have the perfect high school sweetheart story. When Linda's mother met Jack, she said that she knew that was the boy her daughter would marry. In high school, Jack was a football star, and Linda was the popular blonde. They married as soon as Linda graduated in 1965. Jack worked at a local car dealership, and Linda got a job as a bookkeeper for an accounting firm. One friend described them as very romantic towards each other. She said that every year on their anniversary, Jack would add 1 more long-stemmed rose to her yearly bouquet. In 1972, they had their first daughter, Jill, and then 3 years later, they had their second, Shane. Linda and Jack both eventually got promoted, and by the 80s, they were able to build their dream home on the water in Lake Asbury. Now, while the Joneses definitely sound picture perfect, the neighborhood gossip in Lake Asbury suggested otherwise. Both Jack and Linda were rumored to be having extramarital affairs throughout the years. But by all accounts, they seemed to always make it work and stayed together. In 1994, around the time of the Joneses' 30th anniversary, Shane and Jill had officially moved out of the house, and the Joneses had an empty nest. Around this time, Linda hired a high school student named Carrie Davis to help out at her accounting firm. And Linda started to treat her as a sort of adoptive daughter. So much so that after graduating, Linda asked Carrie to move in with her and her husband. This new living arrangement was working out great. That is, until Linda's daughters brought up the fact that they believed that Jack and the 18-year-old Carrie seemed a little too close, and not in the adoptive fatherly way. When Linda confronted Jack and Carrie about this, they admitted they were having an affair, and they had gotten together that summer. Jack said he was in love with this teenager and wasn't going to end the affair. As mentioned before, this wasn't the first time Jack had had an affair. And after Linda kicked Carrie out of the house, She had hoped that she and Jack would work it out like they had done so many times before. That wasn't the case, however, and Jack ended up getting Carrie an apartment by his work and continued their affair. He would see her before and after work, they would have dinner together, and then he would go home to his wife. After kicking Carrie out of the house, strange things started to happen. First, Linda and Jack's house was broken into for the first time. Linda had been the only one home. She was beaten up, tied up, and a note was left in her mouth. Linda was also raped during this incident. Despite this trauma, Jack wasn't all too worried about Linda, because right around this time, he bought Carrie an engagement ring with, wait for it, Linda's credit card. Shortly after that, there was an attempted break-in at Carrie's house, and her car was vandalized. And in November of 1995, this string of attacks would escalate to murder. In 1995, 48-year-old Jack Jones was murdered in his Florida home during a violent home invasion. His wife Linda was allegedly tied up while Jack was brutally beaten. When the police arrived at the crime scene, they found it strange that, despite what Linda described in the 911 call, she had no tape or blood on her. The lead detective, Thomas Wogg, arrived at the scene at 9 p.m. the night of the murder, about 30 minutes after Linda's call to 911. He also noticed some strange things aside from the lack of blood and tape on Linda. First, there were no signs of forced entry anywhere in the house. According to Linda's story, the men in the ski masks rang the doorbell and Jack answered. One would think that Jack would at least try to close it when he saw them. There was no evidence of any sort of struggle by the door. A purse, jewelry, and Jack's wallet with a $100 bill lay on the floor of the master walk-in closet. At first glance, it didn't really seem like a robbery gone wrong. Detective Wogg found duct tape on the floor of one bedroom and found more rolled up on the floor of the master bath. The two phones in the house were still intact. There was a bloody washcloth in one of the sinks of the bathroom. And in the garage, a piece of duct tape had been stuffed inside a cinder block that was part of the wall. Now, there was definitely evidence of a struggle in other parts of the house, and the medical examiner later testified that Jack Jones died from blunt force trauma, and none of the blows were administered after he was dead. Something felt off about this whole situation to the police right away, especially since the sleepy community of Lake Asbury rarely ever had home invasions or burglaries. Unfortunately for the police, after the break-in and Jack's murder, Linda Jones lawyered up and refused to answer any of the police's questions. Despite having no proof, people openly accused Linda of being behind his murder at Jack's funeral. According to one of Linda's friends, mourners said things like, "There she goes, there goes the murderer right there. She put him in the ground." With Linda being the only witness but not talking, the police had to find a different way to figure out what happened. During their investigation, they were able to get a full fingerprint off of one of the pieces of duct tape. Neither Jack nor Linda's fingerprints matched the prints on the tape. The Joneses' house phone records showed that someone had been in touch with two petty criminals in the area, Dwight Danahu and Greg Green. Under questioning by the police, the two men said they were not involved in Jack's murder, but they had a very interesting story to tell. Danahu and Green admitted that Linda Jones had contacted them several times earlier that year and asked them to kill her husband, but they turned her down. So she settled with them staging a home invasion instead. Remember the first home invasion that happened at the Joneses' house? The one where only Linda was attacked? Well, that had been orchestrated by Linda herself. According to Greg Green, Linda paid him not only to help her stage a home invasion, but she also gave him $50 to have sex with her and leave his DNA so that she could allege rape, but promised not to press charges. Police were unsure why Linda would do this. Perhaps it was an attempt to win back Jack's attention after he started his affair with Carrie. Whatever it was, it got the wrong kind of attention, because Linda was about to become the police's prime suspect. Neither Greg Green's or Dwight Danahue's fingerprints matched the ones that were found on the duct tape, but their information provided police with their first real lead. While interviewing the Joneses' neighbors, police found that one of them had spotted a maroon Nissan van leaving the Joneses' house in a hurry right around the time of Jack's murder. Police tracked down every van in northern Florida that matched this description, and wouldn't you know it, one of them belonged to a tax client of Linda Jones's accounting firm, a man named Donald Bradley. Donald Bradley was an owner of a local landscaping company, and his fingerprints were tested against the ones on the duct tape. But shockingly, they did not match, and again, the investigation hit a dead end. However, Donald Bradley would reappear on police's radar a couple months later, when he was arrested for road rage. At the time of his arrest, he had been driving with one of his employees, a 21-year-old man named Brian McWhite. Something about McWhite must have triggered one of the lieutenant's intuition, because on a hunch, he decided to check McWhite's fingerprints against the ones on the duct tape. And they matched. With the fingerprints matching those found at the crime scene, McWhite was brought in for questioning, but he refused to talk. Just when the police were becoming frustrated with McWhite's silence, in a strange turn of events, an 18-year-old boy walks into the precinct with his father and says he knows what happened the night of Jack Jones's murder. Patrick McWhite, Brian's younger brother, tells police that his brother's boss, Donald Bradley, called and asked Brian if he and his brother wanted to make $100 each to help him, quote, beat up a guy. Brothers agreed, and when Bradley picked them up in his maroon van on the night of November 7th, he told them that he was helping out a friend whose husband was cheating on her. She wanted him to beat up her husband, posing as the girlfriend's boyfriend, so he would stop seeing the other woman. According to Patrick's later testimony, as far as the McWhite brothers knew, the plan was always just to beat Jack up or, quote, jump him. But as it turns out, Donald hadn't told them the whole truth. Donald Bradley had been paid by Linda Jones to do a lot more than beat up Jack. In fact, she paid him $35,000 to murder her husband and stage it like a home invasion. On September 14th, 1996, Linda Jones, Donald Bradley, Brian McWhite, and Patrick McWhite were all arrested for the murder of Jack Jones. The McWhite brothers were tried first, and boy did they tell a story that did not make Donald Bradley and Linda look great. Brian McWhite, the oldest of the brothers, testified that after being turned down by two men that Linda had originally propositioned to kill her husband, she went to her client, Donald Bradley, and offered him $35,000. Donald had vandalized her husband's girlfriend's car for her earlier in the year, and she figured he would help her again. After Linda offered him the money, Bradley called the two McWhite brothers and asked them if they wanted to make some money and help beat up a friend's cheating husband. The two brothers agreed to help, and according to Patrick's testimony, they hadn't even originally planned to bring any weapons. Patrick was 6'2" and weighed about 250 pounds. They figured he would be able to rough up the husband well enough on his own. But on the night of the murder, Donald told them to bring something, so they grabbed a wooden stick called a Zulu war club. This piece of wood was about 2 inches in diameter on one end and 7 to 8 inches diameter on the other. It wasn't just a stick, it was a deadly weapon. Brian then testified that they went to Walmart and bought ski masks, but before they went, Donald had called Linda to check on when they should come, and she told them that Jack wasn't home yet, but she would leave the door unlocked and the front porch lights off. The plan was for Brian and Patrick to go through the front door and for Donald to go through the side door of the garage so that he could grab the gun that Linda said Jack was known to leave on the kitchen counter. They knew that Mr. and Mrs. Jones would be in the living room watching TV. When they arrived at the house, Donald made another call to Linda, and she said something about a tax form, which was their signal that Jack was home. Dressed in all black, the three men put on their ski masks and their gloves, grabbed the stick and duct tape from the trunk, and entered the house. Donald entered from the side door in the garage, and Patrick and Brian entered through the unlocked front door. Brian said that as they entered the foyer and looked into the living room, Jack and Linda were watching TV. He says that Linda looked up and made eye contact with him, but said nothing. Soon, Jack noticed them in a mirror. He asked Brian who he was, jumped up, and attempted to fight them. Brian had jumped back, and Patrick was able to grab Jack. And that's when Donald started to beat Jack with the club, in what the court documents describe as a brutal and methodical way. Jack had fallen to the ground, and Donald continued his assault, taking out Jack's own gun that he had grabbed from the kitchen. While this was going on, the McWhite brothers tied Linda up with duct tape, but not too tightly. Brian took his gloves off at one point during this, which would lead to his fingerprint being found on the duct tape. Brian said that they had to tape Linda's mouth twice because she took it off. Brian said that Donald cocked the gun and pointed it at Jack's chest, but it malfunctioned and didn't go off. When it didn't fire, Donald went back to beating him. At some point, Brian and Patrick started to realize that if Donald didn't stop, he was going to kill Jack. Patrick even asked Donald to stop and said that it was over, but Donald continued. After Donald had beaten Jack unconscious, they taped his arms and legs, and Donald told Brian to go to the back room and take some stuff, which ended up being a small amount of money and jewelry. Before they left, Donald cut the tape on Linda's hands with a small knife and told Brian and Patrick to tear the kitchen phone off the wall. But they couldn't. After the three of them left, Donald drove them to his house with the car lights off. He said that if Mr. Jones died, they would all be in big trouble, and couldn't tell anyone. When they got to his house, Donald cleaned the blood out of his van and took their bloody clothes, put them in a garbage bag, and then gave the brothers some shorts and a t-shirt. Donald then took Brian and Patrick home. Donald kept Jack's gun and said that he was going to stick it in some mud somewhere. They agreed that if one of them got caught, he would take the fall and not say anything, which is probably why, when he was arrested, Brian said nothing. It was his little brother who went to the police station to make sure his brother did not take the fall. The McWhite brothers pled guilty to third-degree murder, and they were sentenced to 10.5 years in prison. Donald Bradley was charged with first-degree murder, burglary with a dangerous weapon, and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. And the prosecution had a good amount of evidence that supported the McWhite story. Firstly, phone records showed that Donald Bradley had made 3 calls from his cell phone the night of the murder. They showed that he called Linda Jones's home phone at 7:35, 8:06, and 8:17 p.m. And at 8:30 p.m., less than 15 minutes later, Linda called 911. Donald also had his van detailed 4 or 5 times in a 3-month period after the murder, which seemed suspicious to the police. One of Donald's employees testified that on November 7th, 1995, his parents had a birthday party for him. Around 7:30 or 8 p.m., while he was at the party, Brian McWhite and Donald Bradley called him on a cell phone. They wished him a happy birthday and asked if he wanted to come hang out with them. Donald mentioned that he was going to Lake Asbury. Bradley's defense told the story of a young boy who grew up with a lot of physical and emotional abuse. Fighting parents with infidelity, domestic violence, a later absent mother, severe beatings, malnourishment, the list goes on. Bradley, for all intents and purposes, was a hardened man. But regardless of his troubles, there was no denying that he murdered a man. On May 22, 1998, Bradley was found guilty on all charges. The jury recommended the death penalty by a 10-2 vote. The trial court held a Spencer hearing on June 18, 1998. A Spencer hearing provides defendants with an opportunity to appeal directly to the judge regarding the recommendation put forth by the jury. They are not for the defendant to appeal his conviction, but instead they focus exclusively on trying to change the severity of the penalties imposed. On June 25, 1998, the trial court sentenced Bradley to death. He has appealed twice as of 2018, and he has been denied both times. To this day, Bradley sits on death row. Now, for Linda Jones. In the fall of 1997, Linda Jones went on trial for the murder of her husband, Jack, facing 4 charges: 2 solicitations for murder, because remember, the first 2 men she asked turned her down, conspiracy to commit murder, and first-degree murder. Prosecutors argued that Linda, angry over her husband's affair, hired Bradley to kill her husband, which was supported by the testimony of her accomplices. The nail in Linda's coffin, however, came from none other than one of Linda's lifelong friends, and her maid of honor at her wedding, Janice Cole. Janice had known Linda Jones since the 2nd grade, and Jack Jones since junior high. Linda told Janice about Jack's affair with the 18-year-old Carrie, and how he was buying things for her like a diamond ring, despite the Joneses having money problems. Janice testified that either on November 6th or 7th, 1995, Linda called Janice and told her that she refused to get a divorce. Linda said that she would lose $500,000 in life insurance if she got a divorce, and she, quote, wasn't going to be fat and 40 alone. The $500,000 that Linda spoke of was referring to Jack Jones's life insurance policy that had been established in 1992. Jack also had a company policy with Key Buick, where he was a service manager. Linda Jones was the beneficiary of both policies. During this phone conversation with Janice, Linda says that she could take a gun and kill Jack and get away with it. Janice told Linda she was crazy and there was life after divorce. And then she told Linda that she knew a good man that could help. But once Janice said he was a lawyer, Linda responded, "Oh, I thought you meant something else." In the end, on November 6, 1997, Linda Jones was eventually found guilty on all charges and was sentenced to life in prison, but she was not given the death penalty, unlike Donald Bradley, who still remains on death row. The McWhite brothers have since been released, and all of Donald Bradley's appeals have since been denied. Despite choosing murder over divorce because she didn't want to end up alone, Linda Jones remains in a Florida prison, cut off from the rest of the world, and very much alone. This episode was written by Alexa Morrissey, researched by Victoria Cox, and produced by Michael Morrissey, John Scassia, and Heidi Sherman. Stranger in the House is a Boy Wonder production. You can follow us at strangerinthehouse.com, @_strangerinthehouse on Instagram and TikTok, and @_strangerpod on Twitter. Stay safe, strangers, and thanks for listening.